All right, so with over 120 species, Florida has more orchid species than any other US state. In this presentation, learn more about the natural history, biogeographical affinities, and taxonomy of Florida's orchids, and why Florida's orchids are so special in the context of the United States flora. Special emphasis will be placed on the orchid flora of Northeastern Florida. So Brandon Corder is a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's studying orchid evolution and the relationships orchids have with fungi. And that sounds really exciting and fun. So Brandon is a Floridian, graduate of the University of Florida, and an avid lover of nature and native plants. So Brandon, take it away.
Hey everybody, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, it sounds like it. Thanks for the introduction, Adam. Really looking forward to speaking with your chapter. As Adam mentioned, I'm a Floridian. I lived in Florida first 23 years of my life. I grew up around Flagler County in Palm Coast. So of course I spent a lot of time in Jacksonville and up in your part of the state. So really excited to talk to you. So let's see if I can make sure. Okay, here we go. So what I want to talk about today, as Adam was mentioning, is a little bit about Florida's orchids. So I'm going to kind of take these following perspectives. I want to talk a little bit about what is an orchid. I want to talk about why orchids of Florida are so special, specifically in the context of the flora of the United States. I kind of want to talk about where are these orchids coming from a global perspective into Florida. And we'll finish up by looking at some of the characteristic orchids of Florida, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the biology of them. So let's just get started. So yeah, again, here's me. Actually, this might be either in Baker County or Nassau County. Grew up mostly in Flagler County. As Adam mentioned, right now, my research is kind of focusing on the relationship orchids have with fungi and how fungi have kind of influenced the evolution of the orchid family in some interesting ways. I won't talk too much about that particular thing in today's talk, but maybe sometime in the future if you're interested. And I have to give a shout out to my dad, Jeff, who really got me interested in orchids at a young age. He's a really avid plant person, and I grew up just falling in love with all the plants of Florida. So that really got me started, I think. And I also want to give a shout out to my research group up here at the University of Wisconsin. My advisor is Ken Cameron, who studies vanilla orchids. A few people in my lab work with orchids in Florida. If we have any time, I might mention a little bit of the current research that's going on about that. But just a shout out to the Wisconsin people. Okay, so I want to start out with what is an orchid? And it might seem like a trivial thing to ask, but the orchid family is such a large family. And there's so much diversity in the orchid family that if you look at any two species chosen at random, you might not actually see very many similarities unless you know what to look for. So the orchids share some unique features, specifically in their floral morphology, so what the flowers look like. On the right side, I show a picture of a Phalaenopsis orchid, which is from Southeast Asia. And it really illustrates the kind of the classic parts of the orchid flower. So they have a pronounced lip or a labellum. They have a special organization of their reproductive parts called a column, where the pollen producing and pollen receptive organs are all in the same part. The pollen of orchids is very characteristic. It's kind of in a clump called a pollinium. So those are the features that unite the orchids. But aside from that, there's so much variability. The leaves, for example, are quite different across the entire orchid family. You have very large strap-like leaves or very tiny leaves that just look like a little nub or no leaves at all. There's a lot of diversity in how they grow. There's orchids that grow on trees, epiphytic, grow in the ground, terrestrial, on rocks. that grow semi-aquatically, and all of those are represented in Florida. And again, 25,000 species of orchids worldwide. It's the largest family of plants along with the sunflower family. The highest diversity of them are in the tropics, and especially the montane tropics. So think the Andes. The Andes have the highest concentration of orchids. There's 4,000 species in Ecuador. It's 4,000 species in Colombia, Malaysia, 2,500 species in Brazil. In Florida, we'll say how many species we have in a second, but sorry, in the United States, we have 200 species. So 200 species in the United States, pretty decent sized number, but just in the context of global species that, not really that much. A couple other interesting features that orchids share. They have very small dust-like seeds. On the left side is a picture of a dust seed of an orchid. They also have unique relationships with fungi. So all orchids depend on fungi, at least on some stage of their development, to get carbon. On the right side, I showed a cross-section of a root of an orchid. All of those little brown, smooth things are coils of fungi that have infiltrated the root, and the orchid is actually eating those and taking up all the carbon and nutrients from those coils. Okay, so why Florida's orchids specifically? So every county of Florida has native orchids, and I think that we have this connotation of orchids as being tropical houseplants. Maybe not for this group, as plant lovers and people who are interested in native plants. But a lot of people are surprised when I tell them that, every county almost in the entire United States has native orchids. Florida has many more orchid species than any other state. So we have about 121 species of orchids. The next closest is 71 for North Carolina. Where I am here in Wisconsin, we have somewhere around 55 species, which is pretty good. But again, Florida definitely takes the cake. The number of species that Florida has is comparable even to some of the tropical territories of the United States, like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, which have about 140 species across the two of them, which is pretty surprising. If you look at the taxonomy of the orchids, the different groupings within the orchids, we have the richest taxonomic diversity of any United States territory or state. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And if you look just at the orchids that are epiphytic, the orchids that grow on trees, within the flora of the United States, nearly all of the epiphytic orchids are restricted to Florida. For the US flora, there's only one orchid species that's epiphytic that is found outside of Florida. And there's also a conservation concern. So 63% of the orchids of Florida are listed as being threatened or endangered at the state level. I also think that the orchids just have this very unique mystique to them. They elicit so much excitement. There's all these legends of famous orchidologists. If you've ever seen the movie Adaptation, I won't spoil that movie, but it's a really excellent movie where orchids of Florida figure very heavily. We have these great figures in the lore of Florida orchids like Carlisle Lure, Paul Martin Brown. So there's a lot of interest, I think, in orchids, a lot of excitement around them. So let's just kind of look at the numbers of Florida's orchids. So one thing that's a challenge when looking at a group of plants that are as big as the orchids is that depending on who you ask, everybody has a different definition of what species is a true species and what is not a species. So if you look just at the orchids of Florida, you'll find that the names have changed a lot, and some things are called one thing and really it should be something else. So you may notice that names change very often. There's also some species that may be recognized by some people, but other people say that they should be a part of a different species. So how they are treated, we would say. So I looked at various sources to see roughly speaking, how many orchids can be found in Florida. I'm going to be using Alan Weekly's recent treatment of the flora of the southeastern United States. And he puts 123 orchid taxa present or historical. Out of those, nearly 90% are native. 109 native orchids are found in Florida. So out of our native orchids, 4% are endemic, meaning that they are only found in Florida. 62 to 63% we said are listed at the state level. 0% of them are listed at the federal level. There's no federally endangered orchids in Florida right now. 52% are represented in the US flora only in Florida, meaning taking just the orchids of the United States into account. 52% of those in Florida are only found in Florida. We have several that are possibly extinct, locally extinct or extirpated, or some that have only been reported one time in the state, and we're not sure about the validity of them. So perhaps it was misidentified, maybe it blew in here for some reason and it died out very quickly. So there's a lot of stories like that with the orchids. We'll talk about that a little bit. I also wanted to look by county to kind of see what counties have the most orchids. As we'll talk about in just a second, the orchid flora of Florida can kind of be split into several different regions, and I kind of mean in a global perspective. So we have tropical species that are coming up from the Caribbean and from South America. We have species that are found more in the eastern United States in general, and a couple other little patterns like that. So just based off that, you might expect, since the tropics have the richest diversity of plants, that the subtropical regions of Florida would have the most species, and that's the case. So Collier County and Miami-Dade County in the south have over 50 species, and again, that's out of 123. If you look at Duval County, it's doing pretty good. 31 species of orchids found in Duval County. My home county of Flagler County has 18. That might be because less people are collecting orchids in Flagler County. It could reflect something different. So there's some interesting patterns like that. Okay, so I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about the taxonomy and nomenclature of orchids. It actually ends up being very contentious. So as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, the names of these things are changing all the time. So when I talk to people who are, into orchids for many decades, they have the names that they first learned them as. So Encyclia tampensi was the old name for Encyclia tampensis, the Florida butterfly orchid. That's a pretty trivial change. Another example, Sparanthes lanceolata variety paluticola is now Sequoia paluticola. So there was a whole stepwise progression in that. Other names have changed. Polyrhiza lindenii is now Dendrophylax lindenii. That's the ghost orchid. So that's undergone some name changes over time. But sometimes if you wait around long enough, it'll come back to what you know. Epidendrum Canopsium, the green fly orchid, was called Epidendrum magnoliae for a while, and now the accepted name is Epidendrum Canopsium again. So, just wait long enough, okay? Okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the classification inside the orchids too. So with such a big family, we have all these subclassifications inside the orchids. So you might know that we have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. In the orchid family, we have 5 subfamilies, and those subfamilies are split into tribes and then subtribes and then genera, species, varieties, and forms. So it's a little complicated taxonomically. To look at the taxonomic representation in Florida at the subfamily level, I know this is, a little bit technical, but this is reflecting the major evolutionary lineages inside the orchids. We see that we have representation for 3 out of the 5 subfamilies in Florida. And one of them, the lady slipper orchids, or the cypripedioid orchids, almost make it to Florida. They occur in southern Georgia. So maybe one day those will be found in Florida and we'll have 4 out of the 5. I just kind of think that's interesting. Okay, looking at the largest genera that we have in Florida. So out of those 123 species, the largest genera are Sparanthes, which are the ladies' tresses orchids. These are terrestrial orchids that are found in a lot of open types of habitats usually. They have a spiral inflorescence of white flowers. There'll be some more pictures of those later, but that's on the bottom left. There's 17 species of Sparanthes. There's 8 species of Platanthera, which are the fringed orchids, or some other types of common names go with the Platanthera orchids. There's 8 of those. I think Platanthera is actually the largest genus for Duval County with 7 species. Sparanthes is the second largest for Duval County with 6 species, I believe. Another big genus for Duval County is Calopogon, or the grass pink orchids, which I have kind of the third one on here. There's 4 species of that in Duval County. I think there's also 4 species in Florida, and there's 5 species globally. So you have good representation of those pink orchids in Duval County. And then the Epidendrum orchids, which are epiphytic orchids, those are mostly found on trees, or all of them are found on trees. There's 7 species in Florida. Only one of those gets up to Duval County, though. To kind of tease that apart a little bit more, if you look at not just Sparanthes, but all of the other orchids that are similar to Sparanthes in an evolutionary sense, which we call the Spiranthoid orchids, those actually make up a fifth of the orchids in Florida with 26 species, and there's several different genera of those. A couple other interesting things, this doesn't really have that much to do with Duval County, but just looking at the orchids of Florida, kind of from like a global sense, we have representatives here of some of the largest genera of plants, which happen to be in the orchid family. And a couple of these are also really popular in the kind of in the plant trade. So on the bottom right, there's a picture of an oncidium, sometimes called the dancing lady, or they're yellow orchids. You see these in the store sometimes. There are 7 species in Florida, and there's 1,000 of those worldwide. So I think it's really cool that we have some of those in Florida. Bulbophyllum, we have one historical species that probably is extinct in Florida. That genus has 2,000 species worldwide, mostly in the Andes. So it's unfortunate that we lost that one, but that's still pretty interesting that we got it in the first place. Epidendrum, as I just mentioned, 7 species in Florida, 1,000 to 1,500 species worldwide, which is pretty incredible. The pleurothalids are one of the largest groups of plants that are a single group of plants. We have 3 species in Florida, and there's 4,000 species worldwide, mostly in the tropics. So interesting that we have those. The Vanda orchids, which are kind of those really huge purple flowers that you see in the store, we have 4 of those in Florida, and there's 2,000 species worldwide. So interesting representatives of larger genera. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the different patterns that you find in our orchid flora, and a little bit more about some of the different genera that we might find here. So here's a map of North America. And you can see on here, of course, where Florida is. So if you were to take a trip up to Wisconsin, you would notice that looking at the flora of Wisconsin, there's a couple species that are shared between Florida and Wisconsin. A couple orchids are shared, but the flora of Wisconsin looks very different than the flora of Florida. And part of the reason why is because looking at different plants, there are very well-defined patterns in the distributions of plants. So for example, in the next slide, I'm going to kind of draw some boundary markers that show some of the classic distributions of plants. And notice where they are in relation to Florida. Okay, so you don't have to worry about what all of these are, but on the top, these are plants that are found in the northern forests, or they may be found kind of circumborally around all of the northern latitudes around the world. We have plants that have an Appalachian distribution. So plants that are mostly found in the Appalachians. We have plants that have an Ozarkian distribution found in the Ozarks. One big thing in Florida are the plants of the coastal plains. So the coastal plains are stretching in the low-lying areas from Texas up to New Jersey. And in Florida, we have a lot of coastal plain species. And of course, there's just species that are found in all of the temperate forests of Eastern North America. So some orchids have a distribution that encompasses most of the eastern part of North America, which would include Florida as well. On the other hand, there's some species that have a Western North American distribution, and we actually only have a couple of those that reach Florida. Talking more from a global perspective, across the tropics, some species are distributed along the equator pretty much all around the globe, and we call those pantropical species. So as I'll show in a second, we have some orchids that are found in all of the world's tropics. We also have species that have an affinity more towards the Caribbean or the Central American countries. And a lot of those make it up just barely into Florida. So what I think is really interesting is that our orchids in Florida, they're not all just from one place, but actually they're coming here from all different directions, as you can see on here. Again, we have species coming down from the north, from when Florida was no longer covered by water. It was eventually colonized by species that were expanding their range from the rest of Eastern North America. And like I mentioned just a second ago, also coming from the tropics and from the surrounding islands, such as Cuba, the Bahamas, things like that. We'll look at that in a second too. How did they get here? Well, one thing that we mentioned about orchids already is that they have very unique seeds that are very small, like dust. So a single orchid fruit can have hundreds of thousands of seeds inside of it. And although those seeds do have very specific requirements, they just have so many of them. So it's been demonstrated in orchids that long distance dispersal, even across oceans, is possible. So with that in mind, it's not completely unlikely to think of how you could have seeds being blown in from Cuba, for example. So pretty interesting. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the endemic orchids of Florida. We'll talk a little bit about the introduced orchids of Florida and some of the orchids that may be extinct, and then talk about just our native species. So as I mentioned before, we have about 5 or 6 orchids that are found only in Florida. Now, out of those species, all of them are parts of genera that have one of those distribution patterns that we just talked about. So for whatever reason, maybe they were isolated enough where they were growing, they were able to diverge from those other species. So 2 of them are in the genus Triflora, which kind of has a distribution all throughout North and South America. Sparanthes, we already mentioned, that's kind of mostly an Eastern North American genus. And then Govinia and Polystachia, those are both tropical species. So these 6 species are found only in Florida, which is pretty cool. None of them are that common. Maybe the most common on here is Sparanthes triloba, which you can find on the roadside in South Florida. But you kind of have to go looking for these. That Sparanthes triloba, which I show on the right side, kind of has an interesting story. So it was described as a new species that was endemic to Florida by J.K. Small in 1898. J.K. Small was one of the really preeminent botanists in Florida at that time. Over time, people said, I actually don't really think that's its own species. I think that's part of this other lady's tresses, or I think that's a different lady's tress. So it was sunk into synonymy, synonyms, just like word synonyms. We have plant synonyms for a long time. And actually, it was my colleague, Matthew Pace, who's at the same lab that I work in here in Wisconsin, who resurrected the taxon by showing that it was distinct enough to be considered its own thing. And now that is now considered, the 6th or the 5th endemic orchid for Florida. So these things are still being worked out even today. I mean, this happened in 2016. So a lot of work still being done. A lot of new species are still being described or resurrected in this case. So when I showed that map of Florida, you'll notice that Florida is kind of at the limit of what we would consider to be the subtropics. It's also kind of at the limit of what you might explain to be the temperate regions. So the species that exist in Florida, some of them are just fine, but others are kind of at their range limit. Actually, a lot of species are at their range limit of what they can physiologically withstand in Florida. Particularly when we talk about the tropical species, which a lot of them are not hardy to cold. So as soon as you get to Central Florida, you might get intermittent freezes, right? So that's kind of the limit for what they can experience. Now, a couple species are actually even less tolerant to cold, and they don't want to take below 40 degrees or something like that. So we see that these species at their limit are either extremely rare in Florida or they don't last very long. So all of these new colonizations of Florida are kind of a chance event. You need to have the right seed blowing in the right direction. And once it lands, it needs to get established. So it is true that we add new species of orchids to Florida every now and then just by chance. A lot of times those die out very quickly. So we think that this has happened several times recently. So below, Tetramica elegans is a tropical orchid that is an epiphytic orchid. It's a very interesting flower. I have a picture on the next slide. It was seen twice in Martin County, but never again. So what likely happened was, by chance, it established itself in Florida, but when the temperatures were not right, it probably died out. Two others that I listed below are both tropical from South America. They've only been reported one time from deep in Big Cypress National Preserve. There's a question about, was that a valid sighting of it or not? But I think that it's pretty fair to say that these things happen where things get established and probably die out or even get poached. Same thing happens coming from the other direction. So there's a few orchids that are more northern species that have been seen a few times in the Panhandle or in Northeastern Florida. One of those is Goodyeara pubescens, or the downy rattlesnake plantain. If you go to the Appalachians, it's like the most common orchid that you'll find, but it's incredibly rare in Florida, and it probably is at its limit of its range. So I actually don't know of it having been seen in some time. So, it does kind of work both ways. Here are those three that I just mentioned on the last slide, plus Epidendrum ecuni. So a few of these are considered to be completely extirpated or locally extinct now. Of course, they're doing fine in their usual range, which probably includes Brazil and Colombia and Venezuela. But in Florida, we no longer have these. So I think they're quite beautiful, though. One interesting example of that is Govinia Floridana, which was seen a few times in the 50s and 60s in the Everglades. This is a terrestrial orchid that was unclear if it was a new species or if it belonged to a species that's found in the Caribbean. So the powers that be, they described this as a new species called Govinia Floridana, which was treated as endemic to Florida, so only found in Florida. Unfortunately, there was a few hurricanes, Donna, for example, that came in, and subsequently it hasn't been relocated again. We haven't seen it. So if it is its own species, then it's now considered to be extinct. If it's treated as part of a wider species, then it's merely extirpated, but doing just fine in Cuba, probably. So it's kind of an interesting case. All of its relatives have a very interesting distribution, which is either in the tropics or in the north central states or circumboreal, so like Russia, Canada, Norway. It's kind of an odd distribution pattern. So kind of an unfortunate story. We also have quite a few orchids that are introduced to Florida, possibly through the help of people inadvertently. So I mentioned 123 species, 109 are native. That means that we have quite a good deal of orchids that are non-native. These tend to be mostly species from the tropics, but we do have species that are found in temperate East Asia or South Asia as well. For a lot of them, we haven't really assessed what the ecological impact of them is. But we know that for most of these, their range is expanding. So for example, 3 of these are 3 of the most common introduced orchids in Florida, and each of them has been expanding their range greatly. On the left, Zeuxine stratomatica, which is a lawn orchid. That's the one that's found in East and Southeast Asia, South Asia. Commonly find it blooming around Christmas time, so it's sometimes called the Christmas orchid, and it just grows in lawns. So in Flagler County, I would see it all the time in lawns. When I went to University of Florida, it comes up in mulch all the time. So that has now expanded its range even in California and Hawaii. So this is one that we don't really know what the impacts of it are, but it's definitely doing very well in the United States. Osteoclades maculata is another one. The first records of that were found in South Florida. It probably came over from Central Africa. Now it's found all the way up in Alachua County. So every year it's been going north and north and north. And actually it's uncertain whether it's going to stop in Central Florida, like I mentioned, or whether it's going to keep going. It doesn't really seem to be that prone to frost that I've seen. So that might be one that you might even find in Duval County pretty soon. And a more recent introduction, but maybe the most tenacious of these, is the crown orchid, or Eulophia graminia. This thing, it will grow anywhere. I've seen it growing out of logs, growing out of pavement. Definitely can be found in a lot of different natural communities in the Everglades. That one has been seen as far north as St. Johns County, and that might have even changed, might even be a little bit more north than that now. That one is one that if I had to pinpoint and say one that has an ecological impact, kind of feel like that one might be displacing some native species. That's not really proven yet, but I don't know, that can really just get all over the place. So yeah, these are 3 introduced non-native orchids. Okay, now finally to talk about the native species. So thinking about those geographic regions that we showed a second ago, about 60 of the 109 native orchids that we have are neotropical. The neotropics include South and Central America and the Caribbean and the southernmost part of Florida. These are, mostly confined to the southern part of the state. A couple of them do reach up to the northern part of the state, but that's kind of what's driving that 60 to 50 species in Miami-Dade County number that's so high. And of course, 66 species for Miami-Dade, I believe it was. That's more species than all of the states except for North Carolina for one county. So, that's a pretty impressive number. From my count, about 10 species are widely distributed in some way. So I would say species that are found over all of North America. So Western North America and Eastern North America and Central America, or species that are pantropical. Remember, that means that they span all of the tropics of the world. So 10 species fall into that category. The rest of them, the other 40 or so species, are mainly distributed in North America on the eastern side of North America. These include things that are found on those coastal plains that I mentioned, or a lot of the species that we share between Wisconsin and Florida, for example. So about 40 of those are found in general in eastern North America. So let's look at some of these a little bit more closely. Okay, and I also just put in here about where do orchids grow. I just want to mention that orchids can be found in all community types in Florida. Maybe the only community that you couldn't really find an orchid is in a coastal dune. I don't really know of any that grow specifically in the dunes, but you find them in scrubs, flatwoods, city parks, lawns, hardwood hammock forests, deciduous forests, mixed pine forests. So they really get around. Okay, so here's an example of one of the pantropical orchids. This is Liparis nervosa, or the new name is Diatelis nervosa. So on the top right, I have a distribution map from the herbarium aggregator GBIF, and it just shows every point is a collection of the species. So you can see it's found in South Florida and around the Caribbean, but also Central Africa and Madagascar, India, even into Japan and Southern China. So it's pretty impressive that this orchid gets around so much. In Florida, it's confined mainly to the southern part of the state, in the Fakahatchee, for example, where it grows kind of on floating logs and semi-aquatically, semi-terrestrially. Another orchid that has a pantropical distribution is Polystachia concreta, or the helmet orchid. This one is a epiphytic orchid. It's one of the most common epiphytic orchids that we have. It has a very similar distribution to the species we just showed: Caribbean, Central Africa, East, Southeast Asia. It's also been established non-native in Hawaii too. The closest relatives of this orchid are Dendrophylax and Campylocentrum, which are both leafless orchids. The ghost orchid is a relative of this species. So interesting. Here's two others that have a very wide distribution, but also are represented in Florida. These are the coral roots, or Coral oryza. So the coral roots are orchids that are parasitic on fungi. So they can't do photosynthesis themselves, but instead all of their carbon that they would have taken from carbon dioxide is sourced from fungi in the soil. Those fungi are usually fungi that are mutual with a tree, so like a mycorrhizal fungi. So they're kind of stealing carbon from the fungus. There's 14 species of these globally, mostly found in North America and Central America. And we have two representatives in Florida, the spring coral root and the autumn coral root. And as you might expect, one of them blooms in spring and one of them blooms in autumn. So just take a look at that interesting distribution at the bottom. These are some of our only species that can be found in the Western US as well, particularly that spring coral root. So for that reason, it's kind of unique in our flora. So I actually really like that one a lot. Okay, the grass pink orchids. Here are 3 of the 4 grass pink orchids that we have in Florida. The other grass pink that doesn't occur in Florida is actually found kind of in the Oklahoma and central United States area. That's Calopogon oklahomensis. That's the only one that we don't get. But we do get these, the tuberous grass pink, the bearded grass pink, and the pale grass pink. You can find these very commonly, usually starting in, well, if you're in South Florida, you can start to find them in January, but definitely getting into April, May and June and July. You can find these growing in flatwoods and wet ditches. So, you know, the national forests that you have up near Nassau County and Baker County, these are pretty well represented there. They look like they're upside down with the lip being on top, but actually they're the only orchids that we have that are actually right side up. So all orchid flowers kind of flip during development, and these ones do not flip. So they're the ones that are right side up, even though they look like they're upside down. So that's just kind of an interesting fact about them. And the affinity of these is mostly southeastern coastal plains, but as I mentioned, also central United States and getting into the Caribbean a little bit. Okay, Sparanthes, again, 17 species found in Florida, 40 of them found worldwide. Most of our Floridian species are part of the group that is found in North America only. There's other Sparanthes that are found in East Asia, but we actually don't really get those kinds over here. These can be found in a lot of different types of places, similar to Calopogon, flatwoods, wet ditches, particularly this orchid on the right side, Sparanthes vernalis, the spring lady's tresses, that you can find in any kind of unmowed, good quality roadside. So I see it growing, you know, on the side of like county roads and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. We have a Sparanthes blooming pretty much every part of the year. Some of them are more restricted to the summer. Some of them come up more in the winter or the spring. So this is always something to keep an eye out for. Definitely Sparanthes vernalis is one that's one of the top 3 most common in Duval County. But I mentioned that we also have a lot of Sporanthoid orchids. We have 26 total Sporanthoid orchids. So these have a neotropical affinity. So a lot of these are tropical that are just barely making up to Florida. So Mesodenus leucayanus, the copper lady's tresses, I believe that that species makes it all the way up to Duval County, which would be one of the very few of the tropical orchids that can be found in Duval County. That kind of has a Bahamas and Cuban distribution. If you go down to South Florida, you can find things like Beloglottis costaricensis, the Costa Rican lady's tresses. And of course, that one has a South American distribution, barely making it up to the Everglades. I think all of these, and here's the distributions, all of these tend to be pretty obscure and kind of hard to find and a little bit hard to, they're easy to overlook. So if you familiarize yourself with these, if you come across any of these when you're around in Central Florida, South Florida, or even if you're in Duval, that would be a pretty impressive find for any of these. So these are a couple of those Sporanthoids. Here's a few more Sporanthoids. One of my favorite orchids is the leafless lady's tresses or the beaked lady's tresses, Sequoia lanceolata. In Volusia County, this grows kind of on the side of the road, only in very high quality spots. It's now threatened. Unfortunately, with mowing and increasing lane size on highways and stuff, that's really done a lot of damage to the numbers of this particular species, which is a shame because it's one of the most beautiful ones. So again, this is Sequoia lanceolata, and it's kind of southern Florida friend, Sequoia paludosa, which grows more in the forests. We talked a little bit about Epidendrum. You don't have to worry about what all of these different species are, but I just put this on here just to kind of get an idea of how special these are for the US flora specifically. So each of these maps are showing the counties that an Epidendrum species is found in. And you can see that out of these 7, only one of them is found outside of Florida. And that's Epidendrum Canopsium, the greenfly orchid. If you look at the genus as a whole, the 1,500 species are distributed from Argentina all the way up to North Carolina. So it's a pretty big range. Here's a couple. The 2 on the left were both found in the Fakahatchee of Southwest Florida, growing on things like pop ash and pond apple. On the right, Epidendrum Canopsium, that seems to really like to grow on live oak. See that one a lot around Gainesville, St. Augustine, and I think I've seen it a couple times in Jacksonville as well. So that's a good one to look out for. Here's two that I'm not going to talk about too much. They're tropical affinity species that are related to that Oncidium that I mentioned, kind of with the yellow flowers, very popular houseplant. Both of these are quite rare now, but very beautiful. So they are very much at risk of poaching, unfortunately. And some of the best examples of these two, the cowhorn orchid and the mule ear orchid, have been poached, unfortunately, in the last few decades. One of the interesting orchids that we have that grow in scrubs, particularly under rosemary, with all of this reindeer lichen, this is Tolumnia. It's a very small little orchid. It doesn't have a very long lifespan, but it lives really close to the ground, just at the bases of these rosemary shrubs in scrub. You can find this very rare in Martin County and some of the areas around Jonathan Dickinson State Park, but I think it's either state threatened or state endangered. So that's an interesting part of our flora, though. I have just a couple more to show. Here's a couple of the leafless orchids that we have in Florida. So these have roots that are green, so they still do photosynthesis, but the photosynthesis is happening on the surface of the root instead of through any leaves. On the right side is the ghost orchid, Dendrophylax lindenii. I'll have a picture in a second. In the middle is Dendrophylax parectus, which is a twig epiphyte. So kind of interesting thing about Dendrophylax parectus, although it's a tropical species, it's been found all the way up to St. Johns County, I believe. So if you go looking in the right spots, I don't know, maybe one day they'll find it in Duval, but that's one of the other epiphytic species that does kind of creep up along the peninsula of Florida. And then a really rare one on the left is Campylocentrum pachyrhizum. Has very interesting little flowers on these kind of short branches. Of course, here's the ghost orchid, Dendrophylax lindenii. Really, kind of like the face of the orchids of Florida. One that you find in the Panhandle, Tipularia discolor, the cranefly orchid. This is an orchid that in the north, it's kind of unique for keeping its leaves up all winter. Very few plants in general keep their leaves during the winter. Doesn't make it quite as far east as Jacksonville, but it can be found in Gainesville. A couple other orchids that we have that are related to vanilla. We have 5 species of vanilla, 2 species of Pagonia or Cleistesiopsis. These are both found in Duval County in Flatwoods. That's the orchid shown on the left. Kind of has a distribution that's mainly coastal plain distribution. Pagonia ophioglossoides. This is a very widespread orchid across eastern North America. You can find that in wet seeps and flatwoods, things like that in Duval County as well. Unfortunately, none of the vanilla species make it as far north as Duval. They're all restricted to the southern counties of Florida. And here's their distribution of these. So yeah, that rose Pagonia ophioglossoides actually is pretty common in Wisconsin as well. So we do share species between Florida and Wisconsin. These are just 3 other kind of random ones. I don't really have a good place to put them in terms of their affinity taxonomically, but the 3-birds orchid on the left is a species that I'm studying here in Wisconsin. You can also find that in Central Florida. The green adder's orchid is part of a group of orchids that's terrestrial, but they're related to a lot of the epiphytic orchids. That's also one that's common in Wisconsin, kind of rare to find it in Florida, but I took that picture somewhere in Marion County. And wild cocoa or Eulophia alta, just a really beautiful orchid that you can find in kind of brushy areas sometimes. Okay, the last thing I have on here are the big genera Habenaria and Platanthera. So I mentioned before, Platanthera, 8 species. It's mainly found in the northern hemisphere. So there's about 100 species of Platanthera worldwide, a lot of them in Wisconsin. It's our biggest genus in the United States. Habenaria, there's about 900 species of Habenaria, and it's found in the warm parts of the world and the southern hemisphere. So both of those kind of meet up in Florida, which is pretty interesting. You can find these in a lot of different habitats. So because there's so many species, there's actually a lot of different possible habitat types that these can grow in. Anywhere from really brushy areas. So the species on the right, Habenaria floribunda, the rain orchid, it just grows all over the place in brushy forest areas. Behind your house, if it's brushy, you might find that in December. That's a good one to look for. Some of these are semi-aquatic. Some of these grow in flatwoods, like these species that are kind of like the showiest orchids that you have in Northeastern Florida. These are all in the genus Platanthera. So out of these, a few of them, like the species on the bottom right, it kind of has a wide distribution all throughout Eastern North America. And a couple others are more confined to just the coastal plain regions, those low-lying regions of the Southeast. So here's Platanthera chapmanii, Platanthera cristata, Platanthera conspicua, which is the white one, and Platanthera ciliaris. So I believe that all of these are found in Duval County, mostly in flatwoods. And July through September is kind of the time to look for these. Okay, so that was not all 123 orchids, of course, that are in Florida, but I think that those are some of the ones to know. Some of the characteristic ones. So I hope that you kind of use this as a jumping off point to explore more resources about orchids. There's a lot of them. So Carlisle Lure, who passed away recently, was one of the really big figures in North American orchid biology. And he has this really great book called The Native Orchids of Florida. It's a little bit expensive to find it now, but be on the lookout in libraries. There's one that's devoted just to Florida, and then he has another book that's talking about orchids of North America in general. Paul Martin Brown has a book called The Wild Orchids of Florida, which you can still get for pretty cheap, and that's a really good kind of species by species look at the orchids that you can find in Florida. Prem has a really great website, Florida's Native and Naturalized Orchids, with some really nice pictures. Roger Hammer, if you know Roger, he has a few field guides, and all of them include orchids that you can find in Central Florida and North Florida. I also listed on here the North American Conservation Center. They have profiles for all of the orchids found in the United States, and really great photos. So that's another great resource. I have to shout out the Florida Flora and Ecosystematics Facebook page, which is really great, very active. It's a great place to learn about our plants. And of course, your native plant chapter, just great, on all of y'all for being involved in this kind of thing. And, that's a great place to learn. So with that, I guess I'll take any questions.
So excellent presentation. That was really awesome. I love orchids. Like I kind of grew up loving them as well as a kid. So anyways, Kate has a question. Which Sparanthes do we have in Duval County? Are they hard to ID species?
They are hard to ID. So I was just looking at it a second ago to see, I think that there was 8 different Sparanthes that are found in Duval County. The most common of those would be the spring ladies tresses, which you can kind of find growing on the side of roadsides and things like that. It usually comes up around April. So that's one. The other ones, I'm gonna just quickly run through on my computer over here. Yeah, the other ones are honestly a little bit rare to my knowledge. So Sparanthes floridana, it's a little bit rare. Find that one in flatwoods. So you'd kind of have to be in the right place to find that one. Sparanthes longilabris. So yeah, I would say that the most common one is the spring lady's tresses, and that one is very common. The other ones are a little bit more on the rare side. To tell them apart, it's actually kind of technical. That's one of the harder genera to ID. There's a lot of technical features. So for that one, you might want to invest in one of the guides, like I mentioned, Paul Martin Brown's book, for example. But yeah.
Yeah, I remember it was Sparanthes vernalis it's very hairy, and they're not glandular hairs, speaking of the technical side. And that for me was the easiest one to ID because it's so common as well.
Yeah, yeah. You know, if you were to ask me the difference between Sparanthes brevilabris and Sparanthes floridana and Sparanthes, etonii and stuff like that, I would probably have a bit of a hard time. But there's a couple. I mean, Sparanthes longilabris kind of has like these really long, like horns that come out, the sepals, the lateral sepals. So that one's really easy to tell, but it's kind of rare to find. So you're kind of in trouble with that one, maybe.
Betsy Harris says, can you give a brief habitat description and season for Coral Horizon wisteriana for Duval and Nassau County?
Yeah, so where I've seen Coral Horizon wisteriana, I've seen it in Ocala National Forest mainly, and in Gothi State Forest. So both times that I've seen it, it's been in January or February. So I guess that's what they would consider to be spring as far as Florida is concerned. If you were in Illinois, it wouldn't come up until like April or May or something. But yeah, so January to February, I've seen it growing under sand live oak, mainly Quercus geminata. I don't know if that is true for the entire range, but it tends to grow underneath oak trees. And actually, a lot of the southern coral roots seem to have that as well. The problem with it is that, you know, they're not green. So they're small, they're brown to golden colored, and they don't have any leaves or anything. So they're very hard to see, actually. You kind of have to get down and like crawl around and look for their flowers, which are a little bit white and dotted. So yeah, those are a really hard one to find, to be honest. Take a look in the kind of the slightly dry forests in January and February, though.
So I've seen in our Jacksonville Arboretum actually years ago underneath live oaks. And they have a lot of large live oaks too, and it's pretty disturbed area. It was a zircon mine at one point, but most of the hardwood trees have grown back. But that's where I saw the Coral Horizon.
So the other one, Coral Horizon odontoriza, which is the autumn coral root. In Wisconsin, we get those in very brushy, disturbed areas for whatever reason. And actually, I study that one for my thesis. So I always have to go to like the, just the worst looking little forests on the side of the road or something and just like crawl around in there. so yeah, it can be like that sometimes.
And can you tell us about the Platanthera that's named after your dad and yourself? Or?
Oh yeah. So if you look at the Platanthera in the southeastern U.S., one interesting thing is that they all seem to hybridize with each other. So we have 3 that are orange and fringed. So the 3 orange fringed orchids, and 1 that is white and fringed. And there's also one that's white and not fringed, and there's one that's orange and not fringed. But there's combinations of all of those hybridizing. So we have the white fringed with Chapman's orchid, the white fringed with, Platanthera cristata, and the white fringed with Platanthera ciliaris. So almost all of those combinations had been seen at some point, except for like 1 or 2. And I was just around in Baker County on the side of the road in a place my friend was telling me about that was good for Platanthera. and I saw this species that looked like it might be the hybrid that we didn't have a combination for yet. So I actually had it on iNaturalist, and I didn't really think about it that much. And somebody who was friends with Paul Martin Brown, who I mentioned already, found it and was like, hey, like, you know, I'd really love to like take a closer look at this. So I talked to a couple people, and they're like, yeah, this like definitely looks like the one missing hybrid that we didn't have. So, you know, they ended up publishing it in some orchid journal and making a voucher specimen. And he was kind enough to name it after my dad and I, who I guess discovered it, quote unquote. So yeah, that was pretty fun.
That was really cool, actually. I like that. So
Platanthera corderi would be the hybrid name for it.
That's awesome. Cool. Does anyone else have any other questions?
You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask me if you want to as well. Either way works for you.
So I'm on the hunt for the Mesedina. Lasianthus, is that how you pronounced it?
Lucayanus.
Lucayanus, yeah. There is a voucher in Port George Island.
Yeah. So that one is a really neat one. So yeah, Adam's talking about one of the Spiranthoid orchids. So it has a small basal rosette. It actually has these very nice looking little leaves. It has these like really soft, small leaves, but the flowers are brown and small. The flowers are like impossible to see, but you can find the little basal rosette. You know, the affinity for that one is mainly in the Bahamas, but it is for some reason kind of prevalent in central Florida, especially Levy County, and I guess St. John's and stuff too. For that one, I've always seen it growing where there's like exposed limestone. That's one that actually is partially lithophytic. So it grows on rocks. I don't know if that's where it's growing in St. John's or not, but that's all the times I've seen it in Marion, Levy, etc. I've always seen it growing on limestone. So go figure.
Yeah, I don't know. There's probably old limestone quarries in St. Augustine because they were harvesting it. That they might be there, but on Fort George there are old oyster mounds, and so a lot of this kind of unique and a lot of rare species are actually found on these old oyster mounds, and so that's where I've been looking. So to no avail.
Yeah, that's when I've been trying to send my dad out to go find that one. I'm like, here you go, like look for this tiny leaf in the whole forest and get back to me when you find it. Yeah, that's a cool one. Yeah, good luck.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, Brandon. This is awesome. I could talk to you with orchids for hours. Seriously, I love them. They're just really fascinating and beautiful. So thank you so much for your wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, have a great night, everyone. Thank you, Brandon.